You ever had this weird moment where you step into a space and immediately feel like everyone's radar is locked onto you? You haven't even opened your mouth yet, but something in your gut screams danger. Here's what most people don't realize. According to psychological research, certain individuals are wired with what I call an ultra-sensitive emotional radar system. They're constantly processing emotional information at incredibly high levels, picking up on micro-expressions, tone shifts, energy changes that other people completely miss. But here's the problem. This gift of heightened awareness, it actually makes you visible to the exact wrong people. Think of it this way. Emotional predators are constantly scanning their environment, looking for specific traits they can manipulate. They're not just randomly choosing victims, they're hunting for particular psychological vulnerabilities they know how to exploit. And if you've been walking around lately feeling completely exhausted, like someone's been slowly rewriting the story of your reality without your permission, you need to understand what's happening to you. The truth is, your empathy and kindness can become weapons in the hands of the wrong people. And I know some of you are nodding right now because you've felt this. If you've ever had that gut-wrenching realization that your generosity was being used against you, go ahead and drop a shield emoji in the comments. Let's find our people, the ones who get it. Today we're diving deep into something that psychology has mapped out in fascinating detail. The 7 unmistakable signs that you're being deliberately targeted by toxic individuals. This isn't about being paranoid or building walls around yourself. This is about understanding the specific patterns manipulators use so you can spot them early and protect your energy. Because once you know the game they're playing, you can't be played anymore. Let's break this down. The boundary probe. Okay? So, the first major sign that someone's got you in their crosshairs is something psychologists call the boundary probe. And this is sneaky as hell. Here's how it works. Toxic people almost never come at you with a full frontal assault right out of the gate. That would be too obvious, right? Instead, they start with these tiny, almost innocent-seeming violations of your boundaries. They're literally testing the fence to see where the weak spots are. Think about it like this. They might show up 15 minutes late to meet you, or they'll ask a question that feels just slightly too personal for how well you actually know each other. Maybe they'll make a small request that feels a bit off. Or they'll make a comment that crosses a line, but is wrapped in a joke. What they're really doing in that moment is watching you like a hawk. They want to see if you're going to enforce your limit with calm, clear consistency, or if you're going to scramble to explain yourself with a whole essay of justifications and apologies. Here's where most people get trapped. They'll set a boundary once. Maybe they'll say, "Hey, I need you to call before coming over." Or, "I'm not comfortable discussing that." But then when the person pushes back or tries to negotiate around it, they cave. They start explaining, justifying, defending their position. And that's exactly what the toxic person was looking for. They're not trying to understand your reasoning, they're measuring your resolve. The manipulator is specifically looking for what I call the mask of agreeableness. That phenomenon where you can't say no without attaching it to a smile, an apology, or a long explanation about why you're unfortunately unable to comply. If they detect that you're scared of being perceived as difficult or mean, they know they've discovered an entry point. They've learned that your boundaries aren't actually boundaries, they're negotiations. And once they know that, game over. They'll keep pushing, keep testing, keep incrementally moving that line, until you don't even recognize where your original boundary was supposed to be. The healthiest people respond to boundary violations with what researchers call broken record consistency. They simply restate the boundary without emotion, without explanation, without negotiation. "No, that doesn't work for me." No paragraph, no apology tour, just clarity. And toxic people hate that because there's nothing to work with, nothing to manipulate. So pay attention to how someone responds when you first set a limit. If they immediately try to bargain, guilt trip, or talk you out of it, you're seeing sign number 1 in real time. The information harvest. Here's the thing about toxic people that most folks miss every time. They're running intelligence operations on you from day one. I'm serious. While a genuine friend or partner listens to your struggles because they actually want to support you and see you thrive, a manipulator is doing something completely different. They're mining for data. They're collecting intel. Every deep conversation you think you're having, they're building a file on you. Look at how this plays out in real time. You'll notice these people ask incredibly personal questions way too early in the relationship. Like, you've known them for 2 weeks, and suddenly they're asking about your childhood trauma, your deepest insecurities, your relationship history, even details about your daily schedule and routines. A healthy person builds intimacy. Gradually, they earn access to your vulnerable parts over time through consistency and trust. But a toxic person rushes this process intentionally because they're not interested in genuine connection. They're interested in leverage. What they're really doing is mapping out your psychological landscape. They want to know where your pain points are, what triggers you, what you're ashamed of, what you desperately want, and what you're terrified of losing. They're identifying your unspoken wounds, the stuff you might not even fully acknowledge to yourself. And here's the truly insidious part. They're gathering all of this information specifically so they can use it against you later. Psychology has documented this pattern extensively, particularly in the context of gaslighting and intermittent reinforcement. The manipulator needs to understand your vulnerabilities so they can destabilize you when it serves their purpose. Maybe you mentioned that your ex used to criticize your weight, and 6 months later, during an argument, suddenly there's a casual comment about your eating habits. Or you shared that you struggle with feeling abandoned, and now whenever you try to set a boundary, they threaten to leave. This isn't coincidence, this is strategic deployment of the ammunition you handed them. There's also this phenomenon that researchers call love bombing, and it's directly related to this information harvest. If someone is showering you with intense attention, affection, and interest before they've actually taken the time to know who you really are, that's a massive red flag. They're not falling for the real you. They're overwhelming your defenses, so you'll open up faster and give them access to your inner world. It's like someone offering you an all-expenses-paid vacation before they even know your last name. The intensity isn't about you, it's about gaining control. So watch for this pattern. Anyone who's pushing for deep emotional intimacy at warp speed, who seems weirdly fascinated by your pain points and vulnerabilities, who asks probing questions, but somehow never quite shares their own struggles in return. They're not building a relationship with you. They're building a weapon. And the information you're giving them freely? That's exactly what they'll use to keep you off balance later. Fishing for emotional fuel. Alright, let's talk about what manipulators are actually feeding on, because once you understand this, their entire strategy falls apart. Here's the core truth. Toxic people run on a very specific energy source. And that energy source is your emotional reaction. Whether it's anger, tears, defensiveness, panic, drama, whatever gets your heart racing and your prefrontal cortex scrambling, that's what they're after. Your reaction is literally their fuel. If you're being targeted, you'll start noticing this bizarre pattern, where the other person seems to be constantly poking at you, trying to get a rise out of you. They'll say something inflammatory out of nowhere, make a comment they know will hurt, bring up a topic that's guaranteed to upset you, or pick a fight over something completely ridiculous. And while you're sitting there thinking, why are they doing this? What's wrong with them? The answer is simple. They're baiting you. They need you to lose your cool. Here's what's happening on a neurological level, and this is fascinating. Manipulators often have incredibly chaotic internal emotional states that they can't regulate on their own. So they use something called mirror neurons. These are the brain cells that allow us to feel and reflect the emotions of people around us. When they provoke you into an emotional outburst, they're essentially outsourcing their emotional regulation to you. They're metabolizing your energy to manage their own internal chaos. It's like they're emotionally bankrupt, so they're constantly trying to make withdrawals from your account. Think about the last time someone said something to you that was so outrageous, so clearly designed to hurt, that you couldn't help but react. Maybe you raised your voice, maybe you cried, maybe you spent 3 hours trying to defend yourself or explain why what they said was unfair. And what did they do? They probably got calm. They might have even smirked a little, or acted like you were being too emotional or overreacting. That's because they got what they needed. They successfully transferred their internal chaos onto you, and now they feel balanced while you're spinning out. The absolute game changer here is this. When you stop giving them the emotional chaos they're fishing for, their entire strategy collapses. And I mean completely falls apart. Because if they throw the bait, and you don't bite if you stay calm, neutral, maybe even a little bored, they've got nothing to work with. There's no fuel for them to extract. This is why techniques like gray rock, which we'll talk more about at the end, are so effective. You become emotionally uninteresting to them. Watch what happens when you respond to provocations with something like okay, or interesting perspective, or just a shrug. Whoa. The manipulator will often escalate at first, trying harder and harder to get that reaction. But if you hold steady, they'll eventually move on to someone else who will give them the emotional supply they're craving. Because here's the truth. They don't actually care about you or the relationship. They care about the reaction. Take away the reaction, and you take away their power. The intermittent reinforcement trap. Look, this next sign is probably the most psychologically dangerous pattern on this entire list, and I need you to really hear this because it's the one that keeps people trapped for years. It's called intermittent reinforcement. And it's the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive. And toxic people? They're masters at deploying this technique, whether they're doing it consciously or not. Here's how the cycle works. They treat you badly. Maybe they ignore you for days, criticize you harshly, break a promise, or cross a major boundary. Then, right when you're about to walk away or confront them, they suddenly flip the script. They apologize profusely. They're sweet and attentive. They make grand promises about how things are going to change. They might even do something really thoughtful or loving. You feel this wave of relief like, okay, there's the person I thought they were, they're back. And then, just when you've relaxed again, the bad behavior returns. And the cycle repeats. What makes this so devastating is the way it rewires your nervous system. Psychology shows us that intermittent reinforcement creates stronger behavioral conditioning than consistent reinforcement does. When a reward comes unpredictably, sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Your brain becomes hyper-focused on figuring out the pattern. You start analyzing everything. What did I do differently when they were nice? How can I get back to that version of them? You become addicted to solving the puzzle, to earning the good treatment. And here's where it gets really insidious. That unpredictability creates an adrenaline response in your body. The highs feel really high, and the lows feel devastatingly low. Your system is constantly flooding with stress hormones and then relief hormones, and after a while that roller coaster starts to feel like passion. It feels like intensity, it feels like love. But it's not. It's your nervous system being conditioned to accept chaos as connection. I see this pattern everywhere, in romantic relationships, in friendships, in family dynamics, in work environments. Someone treats you terribly, then they're suddenly amazing, then terrible again, then amazing. And you find yourself holding on to the promise of who they could be, while completely ignoring the consistent pattern of who they actually are. You're literally training yourself to accept crumbs as a full meal, and to be grateful for those crumbs. The toxic person benefits from this in multiple ways. First, they get to behave however they want, without real consequences, because you keep giving them another chance. Second, they keep you in a state of emotional confusion and dependency. You're so focused on managing the relationship and trying to get back to the good times that you don't have the clarity or energy to leave. Third, they can point to those good moments as evidence that you're being unfair or dramatic when you try to address the bad behavior. But I apologized. I got you flowers. Why are you still upset? If you find yourself constantly making excuses for someone's behavior, waiting for them to become the person you know they can be, or feeling like you're on an emotional seesaw that never balances out, you're caught in the intermittent reinforcement trap. And the hardest truth? The only way out is to stop playing the game entirely. You have to look at the pattern, not the promises. You have to judge people by their consistent actions over time, not by their occasional moments of decency. Because decency shouldn't be a surprise, it should be the baseline. Identifying your fawn response. Okay, this one is going to hit hard for a lot of you, so take a breath. Toxic people have this almost supernatural ability to identify what's called the fawn response in potential targets. And if you develop this survival mechanism growing up, you need to understand how visible it makes you to manipulators. Here's what the fawn response actually is. It's a trauma response that sits alongside fight, flight, and freeze. When you're in an environment where you can't physically escape danger and fighting back isn't safe, Your nervous system develops a third option, become incredibly attuned to other people's needs and emotions, so you can keep yourself safe by keeping them happy. If you grew up in a household where you had to constantly monitor the emotional temperature of a parent or caregiver, reading their mood the second they walked in the door, adjusting your behavior to avoid setting them off, becoming the peacemaker or the caretaker, you likely developed a fawn response that's still running in the background of your adult life. What this looks like in practice is that you've become a chameleon. You habitually anticipate what everyone around you needs before they even ask. You're constantly scanning faces for micro-expressions, listening for tone changes, adjusting your personality to fit what you think will make others comfortable. You've essentially become a high-speed processor for human behavior. And while that makes you incredibly empathetic and socially intelligent, it also makes you exhausted. Because you're doing all of this emotional labor automatically, often without even realizing it. Here's what toxic people recognize when they see someone with a weak response. They see someone who has essentially killed the part of themselves that has needs. They see someone who will prioritize everyone else's comfort over their own well-being. They see someone who's been trained to believe that their value comes from how useful they can be to others. And they absolutely salivate over this because they've just found someone they can offload all of their emotional labor onto. Think about it. If you're someone who automatically smooths over conflicts, who makes yourself small so others can feel big, who apologizes even when you've done nothing wrong, who can't rest until everyone else is happy, you're a perfect target for someone who wants a personal emotional support system that requires zero reciprocity. They recognize that you're wired to give, and they have no intention of ever giving back. You become what I unfortunately have to call an emotional milk cow for their constant hunger. The really painful part is that people with fawn responses often don't even realize they're being exploited because caretaking feels natural to them. It feels like love. It feels like what you're supposed to do in relationships. You might drive 2 hours in a snowstorm to help someone move, and when they don't even text you on your birthday, you'll make excuses for them. You'll say, oh, they're just busy, or they're going through a lot, instead of recognizing the profound imbalance. Toxic people test this by accepting your excessive generosity without reciprocating, and they watch to see what you do. Do you eventually explode with resentment and anger? Or do you just try harder, give more, overcompensate even further to try to earn their appreciation? If you do the latter, if you're addicted to being useful, if your self-worth is tangled up in how much you can do for others, they will absolutely use that utility until you are emotionally bankrupt and running on fumes. If you're watching this and thinking, oh my God, that's me, first of all, you're not broken. You developed an incredibly sophisticated survival strategy that probably kept you safe when you were young. But now, as an adult, that strategy is making you vulnerable to the exact people who will drain you dry. The work isn't to stop being caring or empathetic. It's to learn that you're allowed to have needs too, and that real relationships involve mutual care, not one-sided servitude. The covert contract probe. All right, let's dig into something that's probably going to make you uncomfortable, because it requires some brutal honesty with yourself. Manipulators have a sixth sense for detecting what psychologists call covert contracts. And if you operate on these, you're broadcasting your vulnerability like a neon sign. So what's a covert contract? It's an unspoken, unconscious agreement you've made in your head where you give something, time, energy, money, emotional support, favors, with a hidden expectation that you'll receive something in return. Not because you've discussed it or agreed to it, but because you believe that's how things should work. You think, if I'm generous enough, if I'm helpful enough, if I'm loyal enough, then obviously they'll appreciate me, they'll value me, they'll reciprocate. But here's the problem. The other person never agreed to this contract. They have no idea it exists. And toxic people? They spot this pattern immediately and exploit it ruthlessly. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like. You're the person who will drop everything to help someone fix their car, edit their resume, listen to them vent for 3 hours, watch their kids, loan them money, whatever they need. You're there. And you tell yourself you're just being a good friend, just being kind, just being the person you'd want in your life. But deep down, there's this quiet voice keeping score. There's this expectation that all this giving will eventually result in them liking you, respecting you, being there for you when you need it. You're not giving freely, you're investing, hoping for a return. Toxic people are experts at identifying the overfunctioner in any dynamic. That's the person who does 80% of the work in the relationship while the other person does 20%. And somehow the overfunctioner convinces themselves this is normal. They look for someone who will drive 2 hours to help them with something trivial, but who wouldn't even think to ask that person to walk down the street for them when they need help. And when they find someone operating on covert contracts, they test it ruthlessly. Here's the test. They accept your generosity without reciprocation. They take and take and take, and they watch what you do. Do you eventually hit a breaking point and explode with resentment, suddenly listing every single thing you've done for them in an angry confrontation? Or do you swallow the disappointment? Tell yourself, they're just going through a tough time, and then double down, giving even more, trying even harder to finally earn that appreciation and reciprocity you've been craving? If you do the latter, they know they've struck gold. They've found someone whose self-worth is tied up in being useful. Someone who believes their value comes from what they can do for others, rather than who they inherently are. And they will milk that for everything it's worth. They'll keep accepting your excessive kindness, keep taking advantage of your generosity, and keep watching you overcompensate and bend over backward trying to prove you're worthy of their care. The devastating part is that this dynamic often ends in one of two ways. Either you finally burn out and explode with years of pent-up resentment, which the toxic person will then use as evidence that you're unstable or keeping score, or you just keep giving until you're completely emotionally bankrupt, drained, resentful, confused about why you feel so empty, despite doing so much for others. Here's the hard truth. If someone wanted to reciprocate, they would. If they valued you the way you value them, you'd see evidence of it. Consistently. Without you having to earn it or prove you deserve it. Real relationships don't require you to audition for a role or demonstrate your utility. Healthy people give because they want to, and they receive with gratitude and reciprocity. If you're exhausted from a relationship where you're constantly giving and getting crumbs in return, that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of the fact that you've been performing under a covert contract the other person never intended to honor. The guilt trip prototype. Okay, we've reached the final sign, and this one is absolutely crucial because it reveals the primary weapon toxic people use to keep you locked in place. Guilt. If you're being targeted, you're going to hear very specific language designed to trigger what I call boundary confusion. And it's devastatingly effective on certain people. Listen for phrases like these. If you really cared about me, or after everything I've done for you, or you owe me, or a real friend would, or I can't believe you're abandoning me like this. These aren't just casual statements, they're precision-targeted guilt missiles designed to make you question whether setting a boundary is actually a betrayal. And toxic people deploy this language specifically on individuals whose boundaries are wrapped in guilt. People who have been conditioned to believe that saying no is fundamentally selfish or mean. Here's why this works so well on certain people. If you grew up in an environment where your emotional needs were treated as burdensome, where asking for things made you feel like you were being difficult, where love felt conditional on your compliance, your nervous system never learned the difference between empathy and survival. You never learned that you can care about someone and still say no to them. You never learned that protecting your own well-being isn't the same thing as abandoning someone else. So when a toxic person hits you with obligatory language, your entire system goes into panic mode. You feel this crushing weight of responsibility for their emotions, their problems, their pain. You start thinking, maybe they're right, maybe I am being selfish, maybe I should just do this one more thing. And here's what they're counting on. They know you would genuinely rather suffer in a room with them than face the existential terror of setting a firm limit and risking their rejection or anger. What makes this particularly insidious is that toxic people often package their manipulation as victimhood. They'll position themselves as the wounded party and position your boundary as an attack. You say, I can't talk on the phone for 3 hours every night, I need some time for myself. And they hear or pretend to hear, I don't care about you, and I'm abandoning you in your time of need. They take your reasonable limit and reframe it as cruelty, and if you're someone whose boundaries are wrapped in guilt, you'll fold, you'll apologize. You'll take back the boundary and overcompensate to prove you're not the selfish monster they're implying you are. Here's what you need to understand on a fundamental level. Their unprocessed trauma, their emotional pain, their difficult circumstances, none of that is your responsibility to fix. You can have compassion for what someone is going through without absorbing it as if it were your own burden to carry. You can care about someone deeply and still maintain boundaries that protect your own well-being. These things are not mutually exclusive, even though toxic people will try to convince you they are. The reality is that people who use guilt to manipulate your boundaries are essentially betting on the fact that your fear of abandonment is stronger than your commitment to yourself. They're gambling that you'll prioritize their comfort over your own needs every single time, because that's what you've been trained to do. And until you can sit with the discomfort of someone being upset with you, until you can tolerate their disappointment or anger without crumbling, they'll keep using guilt as a control mechanism. I want you to really sit with this. Saying no to someone is not a betrayal. Taking care of yourself is not selfish. Refusing to absorb someone else's emotional chaos is not abandonment. These are lies you've been told, either explicitly or implicitly, and toxic people reinforce these lies because it keeps you accessible and controllable. The truth is that healthy relationships can withstand boundaries. Healthy people might be disappointed when you say no, but they respect it. They don't weaponize your empathy against you or try to guilt you into compliance. Look, if you've recognized yourself in any of these 7 signs, or honestly, if you've recognized yourself in all of them, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not broken. You are not too sensitive. You are not the problem here. What you likely are is a survivor with incredibly sophisticated emotional intelligence that has been developed through difficult experiences. And that intelligence hasn't yet been redirected toward protecting and advocating for yourself. The goal here isn't to turn you into some cold, closed-off person who trusts no one and builds walls around their heart. That's not the answer, and that's not what I'm advocating for. The goal is to become strategic and self-protective while maintaining your capacity for genuine connection. You can be warm and empathetic and generous with people who have earned that access through consistent reciprocal behavior. But you need to stop giving those things away for free to people who are actively using them against you. There's this technique that therapists and psychologists talk about called the gray rock method. And it's one of the most powerful tools you have when you're dealing with someone toxic that you can't completely remove from your life. Maybe it's a coworker, a family member, an ex you share custody with. The concept is simple. You become completely uninteresting to them. You provide zero emotional fuel. Your responses are bland, brief, boring. Okay? I see. That's interesting. No drama, no defense, no detailed explanations, no emotional reactions whatsoever. You become as fascinating as a gray rock sitting on the ground. What happens when you do this is remarkable. Remember how we talked about toxic people feeding on your emotional reactions? When you stop providing that fuel, when you become this neutral, unemotional presence, they have nothing to work with. They can't bait you into arguments. They can't harvest your vulnerabilities because you're not sharing them. They can't test your boundaries because you're enforcing them without emotion or explanation. You become useless to them, and they'll eventually move on to someone who will give them the supply they're looking for. But here's the deeper work. You need to figure out why you've been an easy target in the first place. What parts of your conditioning need to be examined and rewired? Where did you learn that your value comes from what you do for others rather than who you are? When did you start believing that having needs makes you a burden? Why does the idea of someone being upset with you feel like a life or death threat? These aren't easy questions, and answering them might require professional support. But they're the questions that will actually set you free. Your peace is worth protecting. Your energy is valuable. Your time is precious. And you don't need to audition for a role in your own life. You're the main character, not the supporting cast in someone else's drama. If you're tired of feeling drained, confused, and like you're constantly giving to people who wouldn't do the same for you, it's time to flip the script. If this video resonated with you, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and join this community of people who are learning to protect their peace without apology. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these 7 signs hit hardest for you. Let's build a space where we can support each other through this work. And check the description for my newsletter, where I share even deeper strategies for dealing with toxic dynamics and building genuine, healthy connections. Remember, sometimes the quietest strategies are the most powerful. You don't need to make a big announcement or have a dramatic confrontation. You just need to start showing up differently with boundaries, with discernment, with the understanding that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Your emotional intelligence is a gift. Now it's time to use it for yourself. I'll see you in the next video. Take care of yourself out there.